And what you're saying too about how preliminary some of this is, I mean, we forget because it's felt so long with how long
Right.
we've been involved in this and affected by it, but this is still a very new virus, and treatment results are going to reflect that as well. And so, I guess I wanted to ask whether you thought, well, people are bearish, I think you could say, on hydroxychloroquine right now, right? And we've seen that kind of ping pong back and forth with a lot of the different therapeutics as things have evolved from sort of this bullish to bearish about different pharmaceuticals. And I mean, we've even got a sort of stock market vaccine bubble that reflects this as well. And so I'm curious if you think, is this really, is there ever going to be this, or soon anyway, this either nail in the coffin for hydroxychloroquine or silver bullet kind of vindication? Or is this really going to take a while to sort out whether this has benefit?
Yeah, I think it's starting to play out, actually. I do believe that to a degree, there are certain people on either side that are not going to be convinced. There will always be but if they had done this, and if they had also done this, and if they had stood on their head and did this, it might have worked differently in this patient population. I don't think you're going to get to 100% agreement on any of it, but I do think that we are now starting to see well-performed studies come out. Again, the one that just recently came out, man, I think it might have been yesterday, or 2 days ago, but it seems like 3 years ago, was the data out of Minnesota with regards to post-exposure prophylaxis. Again, that's a well-controlled study. There was just a tweet before I came on and met with you here today about how a large study in England just came out suggesting no benefit of hydroxychloroquine. Again, those data aren't, I can't say anything more than what was in a tweet, and so I won't really comment on it. But the point being that well-performed data are starting to come out now, and I think you know to use your kind of analogy, the bullish versus bearish conversation based off of a small 60 patient study that comes out, and then a flip one that may or may not have performed well or not have been done well. I think you're going to start to see less of that now. We're starting to see some higher quality evidence emerge, which is very thankful.
Clarity is definitely a good thing at this time for sure. So, as far as the dynamics, I guess, of how hydroxychloroquine, yeah, of how hydroxychloroquine works, do you think we're starting to learn something about the virus from the very fact that if we're seeing no benefit, or is that still a little too abstract to work out?
Yeah, I don't. Again, assuming that there's no benefit, I think that as you're getting well-controlled data in these different populations, you're starting to get a good idea of the general picture. And what I mean by that is that, again, using the data from the University of Minnesota, you're getting a good idea of healthcare workers or of household contacts, those who have close prolonged interaction with patients who have disease. You're starting to get a good idea of how frequently they become symptomatic. Of those that become symptomatic, are they progressing to hospitalization or death? So I do think we're informing a little bit more on in a more controlled way on the course of the disease. Again, because you have two groups, and again, we're looking at whether or not there's a treatment effect. But if you kind of pool those data together, you are starting to get a better understanding of the natural progression of these exposures. Or if you end up imagine having a hydroxychloroquine in the outpatient infected population, you'll get a good idea of how likely are they to progress? How many do require hospitalization? Again, regardless if there ends up being a benefit of the drug in that population or not, you will get a better understanding of the virus just because you're more closely and in a controlled fashion monitoring it.
I think that's a great point too. That a hydroxychloroquine RCT isn't just a hydroxychloroquine data set, and so I think that's also something to keep in mind when people are for example, that with the Surgisphere data that came out, we ended up having people who are doing hydroxychloroquine trials held up from their work. And these studies, even if we are starting to see it trickle out that maybe there isn't benefit, right? These studies are certainly better done and more important to finish than something like mystery data from Surgisphere, right?
Anything is better than mystery data. Again, I would highlight that well-performed observational data can be very informative to practice. They're never considered definitive. You always want a randomized controlled trial. Again, that's the gold standard. That's what you ultimately want to work towards. But I do think that while you're waiting for that, and in some situations you'll never get that, right? You can't ask every single question as an RCT without some kind of reason to think you might want to investigate that. But the downfall of observational data is if it's done poorly or potentially fraudulently, for lack of a better word, it can certainly halt even the ability to look at these types of things. So yeah, I think that Surgisphere data did tremendous harm on a lot. Again, who even knows what that data is? Again, is that data accurate? I don't know, but the fact that it seems very implausible that it is, and that they won't let people audit the data source is certainly not encouraging. But there's a significant harm to poorly performed studies, particularly if it get picked up by the news media that suggests that there's a harm, and when it's in this hyper-polarized kind of environment that we're talking about.
It very much feeds into a certain conversation, absolutely. So I'm just going to open the floor if there's anything else about hydroxychloroquine or about publishing in general right now that jumps out to you as something worthy of discussion with the infectious disease community, with clinicians, all of that.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll take it on the two different things that you brought up. First, I'd say about publishing in general. It's not necessarily the publishing piece of it that I think is that just needs further conversation. It's that we need to look at what we're reading, right? If things don't make sense, if there's a new 650 hospital database that no one's ever heard about before, and there's no experience with the data set, and it's not been vetted by any of these different things, I think that we need to question that, right? Just like even normally, if we see an observational study and that the results don't make sense, or we don't think that they controlled for A, B, C, and D, we need to take the time to apply those same things to what we're doing right now. And that would hold true in a pandemic or out of a pandemic. But I think that, again, as everything is evolving so quickly, it's just a reminder that whether it's a preprint or it's undergoing peer review, we've now learned that there can be issues with either of those, right? And so just because it's peer reviewed doesn't make the abstract factual, right? You need to go and you need to do your due diligence to make sure that data is accurate.
Yeah,
As far as
sorry to interrupt, but to your point, I mean, it reminds me of stuff our editor-in-chief Jason Gallagher has said, where even during normal infectious disease clinical practice, you're looking at guidelines and literature that is evolving, and you need to be an independent thinker. I mean, you can't just wait to be told everything about what to do, and that requires interpretation as a clinician. I mean, I hope I'm not distorting his words, but I think that makes a lot of sense with what you're saying. Is that you can't just trust what the latest media cycle about a certain drug is. You have to look and crunch the numbers for yourself.
Yeah, and this is just like a hyper example of that, right? Because if you're talking about a normal thing, again, my interest area is gram-negative resistance, you don't get 7,500 papers that come out on a daily basis that are looking at that, right? And so it's a lot, right? But at the same time, if you're going to be using these things to inform care, that's your responsibility to have a critical eye when you're looking at those types of things.
So I think I interrupted you by mistake. What was the second point you wanted to make?
Yeah, I guess the second point is with regards to hydroxychloroquine. And again, I think that we are starting to see some evidence emerge that can better inform our discussions. I think that the randomized controlled trial that we saw out of Minnesota in post-exposure prophylaxis, again, there are limitations to that trial. There's no doubt about it. But all in all, it was pretty well done. And you're starting to see evidence that, maybe there isn't a benefit. And again, that is what it is. And I think it's important to keep an open mind that, again, one thing that's important is that you have to be willing to evolve as the evidence does, right? I will tell you that in March, when we looked at in vitro activity of hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine, it was very encouraging, right? Again, what that ends up meaning, we don't know. And it was very reasonable to think one thing then. But as more data come out, you have to be willing to move with that, right? And so the best evidence that we have right now certainly suggests no benefit. And that's a population that I would have expected, if the drug to have a benefit, it's one of the places I would have expected to see a benefit. Is it possible that the benefit is just small and because there's not a huge progression over to actual infection? Sure. But if you look closely at those data, at least in that population, they're by far the best data that are out there so far, and they certainly don't suggest benefit. And so then again, while I haven't seen the study that was just tweeted about before I came on here today, but they're stopping the hydroxychloroquine arm in the recovery trial, which again is, you're starting to see things build up in this situation. So by all means, I hope there ends up being a population where we do see benefit. Maybe there is. Again, I don't know anything about that population that was studied in recovery right now, but I think that as we move forward, we need to be willing to adapt as that evidence becomes available. We need to be honest about what it shows or what it doesn't show. And then we also need to appreciate that maybe there are, and you started off this conversation with a perfect kind of example of that maybe there are populations where it helps and maybe there's populations where it doesn't, right? Even the remdesivir data, which are very encouraging for certain populations, surely don't suggest a benefit in the sickest of sick patients. And so again, I don't know what the patient population in recovery is at this point in time, but again, when we see those data, we'll have to keep in mind that this is what that population was. And whether, again, maybe it was latent disease, maybe it's not, I don't know, but we need to just kind of be willing to move with those data and be honest about what we're seeing.
Thanks very much. I think you make an excellent point that following the science doesn't mean accepting every piece of math you see at face value. I think that's really a valuable contribution to this difficult conversation we're all having now. And so appreciate you coming on, talking to Contagion. Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure on my end too. Take care.
Thank you.